Lorraine, you're muted.
Thank you. Welcome, friends. This is WPI's second virtual Oceania Hub event. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the Native peoples who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which we work, both at WPI and at our Oceania project centers in Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. We acknowledge the Nipmucs of central Massachusetts, the Wurundjeri of Melbourne, the Maori of Aotearoa, land of the long white cloud, and the Kanaka Maoli of Hawaii and all the Pacific Island peoples. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And now I'll turn things over to Dean Schiller of WPI's Global School for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Lorraine. Thank you for that acknowledgement of land. And it's just coming up to 5 p.m. right now. So I'm just going to go slowly for a moment and make sure all of our audience have had a chance to gather here as we get ready to introduce the second event in our Global School event series for this year. Okay, so now it's 5 p.m. and I want to welcome you all to the Global School event series. This is a public forum highlighting the significant role of our faculty, our students, our collaborators around the world in addressing what we think of as global grand challenges. As the inaugural dean of the Global School, I'm delighted to host tonight's second event in our annual series, which has been generously supported by the Provost's office and organized by our wonderful faculty and project center directors. We have been bringing students to Melbourne, Australia for 24 years, to New Zealand for 10 years, and we've recently started a new project center in Hawaii. Our student projects in these diverse sites focus on urgent issues such as climate change, climate adaptation, and resilience planning, especially in the face of sea level rise across the Pacific, but also things like innovation challenges, co-designing new technologies for rethinking water, energy, or cleaning up microplastics. But we also host humanities projects, that is, students concerned with poetry, placemaking, Indigenous knowledge, or decolonizing science. So we have many different kinds of activities going on across our project centers. And now we are bringing all of these together through the creation of an Oceania hub. I want to thank our faculty members, Mike Elms, Ingrid Shockey, Steve McCauley, Lorraine Higgins, Lauren Matthews, and Holger Dressler for making this possible and for co-organizing tonight's event. Oceania, placemaking, and social justice will explore the complex region that spans the vast Pacific Ocean and the emergent cultural, social, and environmental movements that are both redefining and questioning the region. And we seek through our networks of practice to find ways in which WPI students and faculty can contribute and learn from, as well as seek to advance environmental and climate justice movements that span the region. And crucially, this calls for learning from Indigenous knowledge. As Mishuana Goman notes in a chapter in the book Critically Sovereign, Indigenous scales of spatial justice include a consideration of all bodies, the human, the land, the water. Or, to put it another way, Indigenous interests coalesce around the recovery and meaningful reassertion of self-determination as an inherent and independent reality, and the reconnection of self-determination to land, place, and environment, as well as to the bundles of kinship relations with human and non-human relatives that such connections support. With that in mind, we've invited the celebrated and award-winning Chamorro poet, activist, artist, and professor, Dr. Craig Santos Perez, to join us tonight. We're so honored that you could be with us. To introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, I now will hand over to my colleague, Dr. Holger Dressler, who's assistant professor of history and whose own work focuses on US imperialism in the Pacific Ocean, including a forthcoming book, Coconut Colonialism, which will be published later this year by Harvard University Press. So Holger, I invite you now to join the stage. Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you to all the co-organizers. Really an honor and a privilege to be part of this amazing event and the launch of our Oceania Hub. Really an honor to be part of this. And I have the Pacific right behind me here on my little map in my office. Let me get right into it and introduce our amazing guest for today, Dr. Craig Santos Perez. As Mimi said, he's a Chamorro poet and scholar hailing from Guam. And he's not only a poet and scholar, he's actually a lot of things. He's also enabling other artists to get their platform. He's an editor, a publisher, an essayist, a critic, book reviewer, artist, environmentalist, and political activist. And the list continues. He also has an institutional affiliation. He is actually in Hawaii right now as a professor in the English department in the University of Hawaii. So fellow academic as well, while doing so many other things. In Hawaii, he teaches creative writing, eco-poetry, Pacific literature, and literature more broadly. As Mimi said, lots of fellowships and prizes that Craig has won over his career. Most recently, he received the Gold Medal Nautilus Book Award in 2021. I'm an active follower of Craig's on Twitter, and every day or every other day, I see him give talks and win awards and get some of his edited books translated into various languages. So it's quite amazing that he's so busy and so successful. His art and work has been featured in literary arts venues and festivals and critical environmental conferences around the world. It's not an exaggeration to say that Craig is one of the leading voices in Oceanian poetry today, Oceanian art even more broadly, and also leading voice in environmental justice, hailing from the Pacific. Craig's presentation tonight is entitled Pacific Islander Ecological Knowledge, a poetry reading. And just a logistical thing before Craig gets started, we will have a Q&A afterwards. So Craig will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have 10, 15 minutes for a Q&A. You can use the Q&A box to submit your questions, and we'll look for them and then raise them. So keep them for after the reading. We really couldn't think of a better keynote speaker for this Oceania Hub launch than Craig. So please join me in welcoming to WPI, Dr. Craig Santos Perez.
Saino Ma'asi. Thank you, Holger, for that very generous and kind introduction. Thank you to you and Rachel for facilitating my keynote today. Thank you also to Mimi and everyone at the Global School, both for having me as well as for all the work you've done in and for the Pacific for decades. Thank you to all the co-sponsors at WPI. I'm really, truly honored to be here today. I also want to say that I'm zooming in from the island of Oahu. So I also want to acknowledge the Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka Oiwi, Native Hawaiian peoples of these lands and waters. And of course, I want to acknowledge the lands and the waters, the Aina and Vai of these islands that have nourished me for 10 years now that I have lived here. I am so excited for the topic of today's events. Looking forward to the other presentations, thinking about, as Mimi mentioned, work on Indigenous ecological knowledge, the Pacific, decolonizing science, and I'll even read some poems about plastic as well. The first poem I'm going to read, if we could move slide, please. One more time. Thank you. Okay, so the first poem I'm going to share with you is called Praise Song for Oceania. And this was a poem I was commissioned to write a few years ago for World Oceans Day, a wonderful celebration, important awareness raising event organized by the United Nations. I had a chance to write and then perform this poem at the IUCN's World Conservation Congress when it was held here in Hawaii a few years ago. So it's nice to see in that environmental space the interweaving of the arts and the sciences. Praise song for Oceania. Praise your capacity for birth, fluid currents and trenchant darkness. Praise our briny beginning, source of every breath. Praise your capacity for renewal, ascent into clouds and descent into rain. Praise your underground aquifers, rivers and lakes, ice sheets and glaciers. Praise your watersheds and hydrologic cycles. Praise your capacity to endure the violation of those who map you, aqua nullius, who claim dominion over you, who pillage and divide your body into latitudes and longitudes, who scar your middle passages. Praise your capacity to survive, our trawling boats breaching your open wounds and taking from your collapsing depths. Praise your capacity to dilute our heavy metals and greenhouse gases, sewage and radioactive waste, pollutants and plastics. Praise your capacity to bury our shipwrecks and ruined cities. Praise your watery grave, human reef of bones. Praise your capacity to remember, your library of drowned stories, museum of lost treasures, your vast archive of desire. Praise your tidalectics, your migrant routes and submarine routes. Praise your capacity to smother whales and fish and wash them ashore, to save them from our cruelty, to show us what we're no longer allowed to take, to starve us like your corals starved and bleached, liquid lungs choked of oxygen. Praise your capacity to forgive. Please forgive our territorial hands and acidic breath. Please forgive our nuclear arms and naval bodies. Please forgive our concrete dams and cabling veins. Please forgive our deafening sonar and lustful tourisms. Please forgive our invasive drilling and deep sea mining. Please forgive our extractions and trespasses. Praise your capacity for mercy. Please let my grandpa catch just one more fish. Please make it stop raining soon. Please make it rain soon. Please spare our fragile farms and fruit trees. Please spare our low-lying islands and atolls. Please spare our coastal villages and cities. Please let us cross safely to a land without war. Praise your capacity for healing. Praise your cleansing rituals. Praise your holy baptisms. Praise your pacific stillness. Praise your capacity for hope. Praise your rainbow warrior and peace boat. Praise your hokulea and sea shepherd. Praise your Arctic sunrise and freedom flotillas. Praise your nuclear-free and independent Pacific movements. Praise your marine stewardship councils and sustainable fisheries. Praise your radical seafarers and native navigators. Praise your ocean conservancies and surf rider foundations. Praise your whale hunting and shark finning bands. Praise your sanctuaries and no-take zones. Praise your wave and tidal energy. Praise your blue humanities. Praise your capacity for echolocation. Praise our native names for you that translate into creation stories and song maps. Tasi, Kai, Tai, Moana Nui, Vasa, Tahi, Vaitui, Wansawara. Praise your capacity for communion. Praise our common heritage. Praise our pathway and promise to each other. Praise our most powerful metaphor. Praise your vision of belonging, our endless saga. Praise your blue planet, one world ocean. Praise our transoceanic past, present, future, flowing through our blood. Thank you so much. It was a journey to write that poem. Um, giving the assignment to write a poem about the ocean, which is so vast, so complex, so many unknown depths and unexplored places that when I first started writing, I just felt the overwhelming urge to praise the ocean, our mother, the source of all life. And as I was writing that poem, I also had to confront all the threats and dangers that the ocean is facing from civilization. And so that's when I started wanting to also ask forgiveness and to ask for mercy in these times where, of course, the ocean is also rising, also becoming a threat to us in some ways. And so in honor of the global school and the ocean as that which connects us and flows throughout our bodies and around the planet, to open with that poem. So thank you for listening. Next slide, please. Okay, my next poem is speaking of this theme of plastics. One of the books I love reading to my daughters, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish by Dr. Seuss. I ended up doing a recycling or remixing of this poem or of this book into a poem called One Fish, Two Fish, Plastics, Dead Fish. Some fish are sold for sashimi, some are sold to canneries, and some are caught by hungry slaves to feed what wealthy tourists crave. Farm fish, fish sticks, frankenfish collapse. From the Pacific to the Atlantic, from the Indian to the Arctic, from here to there, dead zones are everywhere. Overfishing, purse seine, ghost fishing, bycatch. This one has a little radiation. This one has a little mercury. Oh me, oh my, what schools of bloated fish float by. Here are fish that used to spawn, but now the water is too warm. Some are predators and some are prey. Who will survive? I can't say. Say, look at its tumors. 1, 2, 3. How many tumors do you see? 2 fish, 1 fish, filet-o-fish, no fish. That was my revision of Dr. Seuss, thinking about, of course, reading this book in the Pacific has a very different affect when, we're dealing with the collapsing of various fish stocks, of which many Pacific nations depend upon. And, thinking about, again, all the threats, not only to the ocean, but of course, all the marine life. And so I wanted to again, share that poem, connecting to Praise Song with Oceania and thinking about how all life in the ocean is under threat, especially our fish. Next slide, please. Okay, continuing with the theme, the next poem I'm going to share is called Age of Plastic. Seems like I don't have to tell any of you about the huge plastic problem in the Pacific, washing up upon our beaches, polluting the waters. And so I was also asked to write a poem about plastic for a beach cleanup here in Hawaii. And at the time, this was several years ago, my wife was pregnant. And so as I was thinking about plastic, I was also seeing it everywhere. And so this is the poem that came out of that meditation. Age of Plastic. The doctor presses the plastic probe against my pregnant wife's belly. Plastic leaches estrogenic and toxic chemicals. Ultrasound waves pulse between plastic, tissue, fluid, and bone until the embryo echoes. Plastic makes this possible. My wife labors at home in an inflatable plastic tub. Plastic disrupts hormonal and endocrine systems. After delivery, she stores her placenta in a plastic freezer bag. Plastic is the perfect creation because it never dies. Our daughter sucks on a plastic pacifier. Whales, plankton, shrimp, and birds confuse plastic for food. The plastic pump whirls. Breast milk drips into a plastic bottle. Plastic keeps food, water, and medicine fresh. Yet, how empty plastic must feel. To be birthed, used, then disposed by us, degrading creators. In the oceans, 1 ton of plastic exists for every 3 tons of fish. How free plastic must feel when it finally arrives to the paradise of the Pacific Gyre. Will plastic make life impossible? Our daughter falls asleep in a plastic crib, and I dream that she's composed of plastic so that she too will survive our wasteful hands. So the thing is, when you think about plastic and see it everywhere, it starts to come alive and create its own kind of agency. And so that was kind of where the poem took me, thinking about how much labor we ask plastic to do and how easily we then dispose of it as its creators. And of course, as I'm sure many of you will speak to in terms of microplastics, how the plastic will outlive us all. And thinking about plastic floating around the ocean as a kind of paradise where it doesn't have to hold or carry anything for us anymore. It can just maybe be free in the ocean. It's kind of a twisted vision. But that kind of climaxes at the end of the poem, thinking about how my daughter, how I'm wishing she's composed of plastic. And I see a comment in the chat how plastic is in us. So technically, she is partially composed of plastic, and hopefully she might survive as well, as plastic will survive our wastefulness. Next slide, please. Okay, now I want to bring us upon the land. We've been out in the water for a bit. And this next poem takes us to my homeland of Guam. The poem is called Amut. Amut in our language means medicine, and most often refers to kind of medicinal herbs and plants that healers called Eamtis use for various kinds of ailments. And unfortunately, one of the biggest issues of environmental justice happening on Guam is the impact of the US military. Currently, Guam is a US territory, and the military occupies 30% of our entire landmass. So it's one of the most militarized places on the planet. And As you know, the military, not only being one of the world's largest emitters of carbon, is of course a extreme polluter as well. So in Guam, there are more than a dozen Superfund sites, all kinds of chemicals from Agent Orange to forever chemicals have seeped into the soil and aquifer. And unfortunately, there for the past like 15 years, there's been a new military buildup happening in Guam, which I've been part of the movement against. And one of the things they're doing is building a live firing range complex. And unfortunately, they're clearing thousands of acres of tropical rainforest in an area which is rich in amut, usually where the healers go to collect the plants and herbs for their medicines, and all being bulldozed to create this firing range. And so I was asked to again write a poem about this topic, and I'm going to share two of them. The first is in the voice of the amut, or from the plant's perspective, and talking about how it first met an Eamtis, or a healer. Amut. The first Eamtis who found me in the deep jungle bowed to my branches, called me Saina, elder, and shared stories of her sick village. I pitied them. No roots, fragile bark, prone to illness and pain. They weep like no other wounded animal on this island. So I gifted her my leaves to soothe her people. And when the time came, I granted her permission to teach her daughter the places I grow abundant, what illnesses I treat, when to harvest. And this was how we grafted Itautau, the people, to Itano, the land, until doctors arrived and hospitals erected, until bulldozers uprooted our home, until militaries and toxins infected the soil, until barbed wire fences separated us, until Itautau died from cancer and diabetes. After so much loss, the descendants of Eamtis are now returning to relearn my names and plant the sacred language of Amut back into their bodies, so that we may grow perennially, so that we may once again blossom and heal. One of the most inspiring things to come out of the demilitarization movement back home has been the kind of revitalization of the Amut tradition, and kind of the younger generations learning from the last remaining elders who still carry this traditional knowledge, and seeing then all these healers joining the demilitarization movement as well. And so it's really brought many different communities together, to protect the environment, and also all our customs that are tied to the land, such as these traditional medicines. This next poem, next slide, please. It is titled Family Trees. And you can see in the middle of the slideshow, I have a map of Guam. Some of you might be familiar with. The darker shade of red is where all the military bases are. So you can see it's about 30% of the island. The picture on the left is one of the bases. You can see how much land has been cleared to build or to construct the Air Force Base in that case. Now, one of the same area that they're bulldozing for the firing range is also the home of the last mother tree of this tree on the right-hand side. In Chamorro, it's called Hadzun Lagu, which translates as fire tree. And It's basically it's a native tree that used to be abundant. Now there's only a single tree left on island, and so and it's within the confines of the military base as well. And so what I was asked to do is to write a poem for the Guam Educator Symposium on Soil and Water Conservation. They asked me to write a poem about trees, and being from Guam and an activist, it's hard to just write a poem about trees without, politics and colonialism and environmental justice all coming into it. So this poem tries to bring all these together. You'll hear some words in Chamorro. These are the names of different native trees, including the Hudson Lagu, which I just mentioned. And this area that they're bulldozing is called Litekzan. And so you'll hear that word in the poem as well. Family trees. Before we entered the jungle, my dad asked permission of Itata Motna, the spirits who dwell within. He walked slowly with care to teach me, like his father taught him, how to show respect. Then he stops and closes his eyes to teach me how to listen, Ekanguk, as the winds exhale and billow the canopy, tremble the understory, and conduct the wild orchestra of all breathing things. Nizuk, Lemai, Ifit, Zoga, Nunu, he chants in a tone of reverence, calling forth the names of each tree, each elder who has provided us with food and medicine, clothes and tools, canoes and shelter. Like us, they grew in dark wombs, sprouted from seeds, were nourished by the light. Like us, they survived the storms of conquest. Like us, roots anchor them to this island, giving breath, giving strength to reach towards the Pacific sky and blossom. When you take, my dad says, take with gratitude and never more than what you need. He teaches me the phrase eminent domain, which means theft, means to turn a place of abundance into a base for destruction. The military uprooted trees with bulldozers, paved the fertile earth with concrete, and planted toxic chemicals and ordinances in the ground. Barbed wire fences spread like invasive vines, whose only fruit are the cancerous tumors that bloom on every branch of our family tree. Today, the military invites us to collect plants and trees within areas of Litekzan slated to be cleared for impending construction. Fill out the appropriate forms and wait 14 business days for a background check. If we receive their permission, they'll escort us onto base so we can mark and claim which trees we want delivered to us after removal. They say this is a benevolent gesture, but why does it feel like a cruel reaping? One tree my dad never showed me is the endangered Hudson Lagu, the last of which is struggling to survive in Litekzan, its only home. Today, the military plans to clear the surrounding area for a live firing range, making the tree even more vulnerable to violent winds, invasive pests, and stray bullets. Don't worry, they say. We'll build a fence around the tree. They say this is an act of mitigation, but why does it feel like the disturbed edge of extinction? Ekanguk, ancient whispers rouse the jungle. Listen, oceanic waves stir against the rocks. Ekanguk, Itata Motna call us to rise. Listen, Ichonkin Zoga calls us to stand tall. Ekanguk, Ichunkin lemai calls us to spread our arms wide, listen. Ichunkin nunu calls us to link our hands, ekunguk. Ichunkin ifit calls us to be firm, listen. Ichunkin nizuk calls us to never break, ekunguk. Ihalam tanu calls us to surround Ihadzulagu and chant, we are the seeds of the last fire tree. We are the seeds of the last fire tree. We are the seeds of the last fire tree. Ahi, no, we do not give you permission. Unfortunately, despite years of activism against this buildup, it was still approved by the Department of Defense, and the bulldozing has started, sadly, and unfortunately, they've also started unearthing and disturbing dozens of ancient burial sites as well, which we didn't know were there, of course, and so now that's besides uprooting all these trees, are now disturbing our ancestors and removing their bones from their resting places. Next slide, please. Okay, this is my final poem. It's called Chanting the Waters. And this was written for an event we did here in Hawaii a couple of years ago to show solidarity and to raise awareness and funds for the Standing Rock tribe of water protectors. And so I wanted to write this poem in honor of our Native American cousins, and to also kind of connect the water issues that they're fighting with some of the issues here in the Pacific and, of course, around the world. It actually is Mimi there? Can Mimi unmute yourself?
I
All right. All right. This is actually a call and response poem. And so I need your help a little bit. Are you able to?
Sure.
Okay. All right. When I say the word say, I need you to say water is life.
Okay, got it.
All right. Chanting the waters. Say.
Water is life.
Because our bodies are 60% water. Because my wife labored for 24 hours through contracting waves. Because water breaks forth from shifting tectonic plates. Say.
Water is life.
Because amniotic fluid is 90% water. Because she breathed and breathed and breathed. Because our lungs are 80% water. Because our daughter crowned like a new island. Say.
Water is life.
Because we tell creation stories about water. Because our language flows from water. Because our words are islands writ on water. Because it takes more than 3 gallons of water to make a single sheet of paper. Say.
Water is life.
Because water is the next oil. Because 180,000 miles of US oil pipelines leak every day. Because we wage war over gods and water and oil. Say.
Water is life.
Because our planet is 70% water. Because it takes 2 gallons of water to refine 1 gallon of gasoline. Because it takes 20 gallons of water to make a pound of plastic. Because the average American water footprint is 2,000 gallons a day. Say.
Water is life.
Because 1 billion people lack access to drinking water. Because women and children walk 4 miles every day to gather clean water and deliver it home. Say.
Water is life.
Because our bones are 30% water. Because if you lose 5% of your body's water, you become feverish. Because our bodies won't survive a week without water. Say.
Water is life.
Because corporations privatize, dam, and bottle our waters. Because plantations divert our waters. Because animal slaughterhouses consume our waters. Because pesticides, chemicals, lead, and waste poison our waters. Say,
Water is life.
because they bring their bulldozers and drills and drones. Because we bring our feathers and lei and sage and shells and canoes and hashtags and totems. Because they call us savage and primitive and riot. Because we bring our treaties and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Because they bring their banks and politicians and pepper spray and bullets. Because we bring our songs and schools and prayers and chants and ceremonies. Because we say stop, keep the oil in the ground. Because they say shut up and vanish. Because we are not moving. Because we bring all our relations and all our generations and all our live streams. Say,
Water is life.
because our drumming sounds like rain after drought, echoing against taut skin. Because our skin is 60% water. Say,
Water is life.
because every year, millions of children die from waterborne diseases. Because every day, thousands of children die from waterborne diseases. Because by the end of this poem, 5 children will die from waterborne diseases. Say,
Water is life.
because our daughter loves playing in the ocean. Because someday she'll ask, where does the ocean end? Because we'll point to the dilating horizon. Say,
Water is life.
because our eyes are 95% water. Because we'll tell her ocean has no end. Because sky and clouds lift ocean. Because mountains embrace ocean into blessings of rain. Because ocean, sky, rain, lake fills aquifers and lakes. Because ocean, sky, rain, lake flows into the Missouri River. Because ocean, sky, rain, lake, river returns to the Pacific and connects us to our cousins at Standing Rock. Because our blood is 90% water. Say,
Water is life.
because our hearts are 75% water. Because I'll teach my daughter our people's word for water, Hanum, Hanum, Hanum. So the sound of water will always carry her home. Say,
Water is life.
say,
Water is life.
say.
Water is life.
Mahalo. Thank you, Mimi. That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I'm about out of time, but I just wanted to share a few last thoughts. Slide, please. And so just kind of thinking about poetry and ecological knowledge, thinking about how, we can use poetry to express our indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and customs around the environment. I love how poetry foregrounds our interconnectedness, kinship, and genealogical ties with the ocean, land, and more than human species. Thinking of how poetry highlights indigenous histories and names of places, and of course reconnects us to the sacredness and spirituality of the earth. And so important in our times that how poetry can critique and protest environmental injustice and the impacts of climate change. Beautiful picture of Hokulea there as well. Next slide. And of course, I teach Pacific environmental poetry, and beyond just its symbolic meanings, I found it really effective in terms of educating publics on environmental issues. So I often think of literature as a creative form of environmental literacy. I think poetry has the power to humanize climate communication, information, and scientific data. Really important when there is so much data to tell human stories as well. I believe poetry has the power to inspire and empower Pacific Islanders to protect and defend our lands and waters. So it has a activist dimension. And as I alluded to throughout, I often perform these poems at activist events. And I think it does invite non-Pacific Islanders to empathize with and support the struggles of Pacific peoples. And lastly, I think it could help us imagine a decolonized and sustainable future for all generations. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to end with just a little bit about a project I've been involved in for a couple of years that really embodies all of those elements I just mentioned, called the My Hawaii Story Project. And this is in collaboration with a nonprofit called Pacific Writers Connection. And basically we facilitate a writing contest for middle schoolers throughout the state of Hawaii. And we have, we work with their teachers to give them curriculum, and we choose the best poems across the state. And we then publish the poems in the little chapbook you can see on the left side. And then we invite all the students and their families to come to Oahu to present their work at the large annual environmental conference here. So it's wonderful to have these youth voices in that environmental science space, and to see their families and to have the students get up and read their poems about environmental justice, about their love for the lands and waters of Hawaii. And actually, in this picture, I'm just reminded that we were scheduled at the same time the governor was to speak, and everyone was so fed up with his empty rhetoric that they all came to our session. We had like several hundred people at ours just to hear these really authentic, genuine, powerful, inspiring youth voices talking about the climate and the environment. Slide, please. So with that said, I just want to end with a final Saina Ma'asi. Thank you, mahalo again for having me. For listening to these poems and for addressing such important topics in the Pacific. I'm so excited to be in conversation with all of you. And I hope perhaps I get to meet the Hawaii team when you all are back here in person. Again, Saina Ma'asi and mahalo.
Thank you so much, Craig, for that great reading, beautiful and moving at the same time, interweaving text and context, which I found very fascinating. I'm an historian myself, so I'm always like, wow, the text, the poetry moves me, but then to hear the context about these poems was also fascinating for me to hear. We have around 10 minutes for Q&A, if that's okay with you. We have a Q&A box here on Zoom. If you want to plug in your question, you can also, I think, raise your hand if you're a panelist, or use the chat there. And let's get started. I have a few questions myself, but let's get started with Mike, one of my colleagues here at WPI. He had a question in the chat. Mike, do you want to say that in person to Craig, or should I just read it out?
Yeah, no, I just was struck by how hopeful I felt listening to your poetry and about such dark topics and such difficult topics. And I was just wondering, do you feel hopeful? And as you're giving voices to the ocean, to the animals of the ocean, to indigenous knowledge, I was just very moved by that.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate that. I definitely do. I do feel hope, but I find myself having to cultivate those feelings, or to even exercise hope as a muscle. And so the things that give me hope is really, well, maybe to go off that last slide, to be around youth poets, to be around young people who really care about the environment and still feel a sense of wonder and awe when they're, amidst the natural world. And so that definitely gives me hope. The youth climate movement inspires me so much, and seeing their just their fierceness and passion really keeps me going. And, then just being part of environmental justice, climate justice movements here in Hawaii and Guam has really kind of taught me how important it is to stand up for what we believe in and to fight for the lands and waters. And so, that gives me hope. Meeting folks like you and learning about the amazing work that you're doing also gives me hope. So I'm always looking for those hope spots, as they're called, that keep me going and writing the next poem.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks, Craig. Mimi had a question. Let's go in order. Mimi, Ingrid, some other questions. Mimi, do you want to put that question to Craig directly as well?
Sure. Thank you, Craig. That was so powerful. Every one of the poems you read. And I'm just struck by one aspect that I want to comment on from my role as, being at WPI, which is known as a sort of science, tech, and engineering school, but we require our students to do humanities as well. And I'm really thinking about the importance of your poetry for students who work in science and technology fields to become sensitized to the kinds of experiences you're describing. So I just wondered if you could say a little about whether and how poetry can help us teach engineering ethics.
That is a great question. Well, I was really struck when Hover first invited me here. I was like, oh, a Polytechnic Institute. I've never performed poetry at a place like that. So I was really excited. And, I've been lucky enough to engage with lots of folks in the sciences here in Hawaii. And what's great is they really value the kind of humanities in terms of its power to help them communicate a lot of their scientific findings and data. I think they're seeing how effective that kind of communication can be, especially towards the youth, and then also to touch upon the more human and emotional dimensions of whether it's climate change or other kinds of environmental phenomena. Now, that said, I think I've also enjoyed, I did a workshop at one of these conferences on poetry for the sciences. And so I also really love it when science and technology people write their own poetry and are able, are given a space where they can be creative as well. And so I think that's been really a fun engagement, because I think there is so much more interdisciplinarity these days, as exemplified, it seems, at what you're doing at WPI. And so, I just hope to see more of that collaboration, more humanities folks learning and engaging with environmental studies and the sciences, and then more like engineers and scientists writing their own poetry and being creative, maybe making art and stuff like that. So I think the more that we learn from each other, the stronger our movements will be.
Yeah, that's great, because we all need to bring our whole self, right, to whatever we're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. I think related to this is Lorraine's question on some of the themes that the young poets take up. Lorraine, do you want to ask that question?
Sure. I just want to say, as someone who's taught writing at WPI for almost 20 years now, our students crave alternative forms of expression. And our creative writing courses are always over-enrolled. Our music courses are fully enrolled. I think we need more of this. I'm wondering, your young students, what themes did they take up in their poetry? Do you have any favorite lines from some of their work?
Well, for the middle school students, I don't work with them directly, but more so I'll work with like judging the poems as we do final selections. And there's so much I love about their poems. We usually give them a theme. I think that year it was resilience in the face of climate change was So we kind of provide the theme for them, and then they get to respond how they, whatever they're feeling. And there's a range. Most of them usually speak about how much they love animals, or they love the beach. They love, being out in nature. And then we have another portion of students who are much more critical, where they're actually writing against, pollution and plastic waste, other kinds of environmental justice issues. And what I've noticed as I've been involved in this project is that that kind of writing is becoming more prominent amongst that age group. And so what that tells me is that they're becoming more aware of environmental injustice here. And I think that to me is really powerful. But just to comment briefly on what you're saying about teaching writing, even here at University of Hawaii, kind of two of my signature classes, one is eco poetry, where I often get a lot of environmental studies students, a lot of folks in the sciences. And that's wonderful, because I think they too are craving that creative space. The other course I teach often is on food writing, food literature. And even there, I get a lot of, like this semester, I have a bunch of biology, physics, chemistry students in my food writing classes. And so that's, again, great to just see that, they're interested in literature and writing and being creative.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. They're looking for good food tips, probably, among other things. Ingrid, you had a question on Oceania and sort of the naming of the region that we've actually talked about in our group already before, and at another event. Ingrid, do you want to ask Craig that question?
Yeah. So thank you again, Craig, for sharing your work, and this exactly sort of in the vein of how we use words and how we frame things with language. And we've struggled with the question of whether Oceania is a term, the right term, a good way to describe this region. And you referenced it in one of your poems, mentioning Moana and Kai. And I'm just wondering what your point of view is on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Growing up on Guam, we always use the Pacific. The term Oceania was not familiar to me until I started, doing more research as a student and reading the work of Tongan scholar Epeli Ha'ofa, who writes a lot about Oceania and our Sea of Islands. And so, now I use both terms, Oceania and the Pacific. I'm also affiliate faculty with the Center for Pacific Island Studies, which is what it's called at here in the University of Hawaii. And so it depends on the context, but I kind of as a poet, instead of just choosing one or the other, I'm kind of interested in the poetics of each of the terms and their histories. So I use both. Also, thinking about the colonial terms like Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. These are terms that also are problematic, but are being reclaimed in some spaces. And then even in the US context, usually we use Pacific Islanders, but more of us are using Pacifica, different kinds of terms for that. And there are all kinds of other identity formations like AAPI, which you probably heard, like Asian American Pacific Islander. Pacific Islanders are often also grouped under Indigenous or Native American identity markers. And so for me, I try to stay in that complexity, and depending on the context, will determine what I'm using. I'm actually editing an anthology right now where we had the same debate. It's an environmental humanities anthology. We're should we call it environmental humanities in the Pacific or in Oceania? we ended up using both. So it's going to be environmental humanities in Oceania and the Pacific Islands. And so, it's not a perfect formulation, but that's kind of, again, wanting to try to hold all of that together.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. We still have a minute or so for additional questions. I think in the Q&A we have some praise songs for your poems from Sarah and from Melissa. Thanks for that. No questions, but gratitude.
Thank you.
I did have a question myself, if we have another minute or so, just about your inspiration and creativity. I found that quite interesting in your context sections, that you several times actually said that you were asked to write a poem about plastic or about some of the other issues there, about water. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that, where your inspiration comes from. Of course, you're a poet and artist, you get inspiration everywhere, but it seems like some of those poems were also not sort of solicited, but created in a certain context. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on this kind of creative background of some of the poems you've read today.
Yes, thank you for noting that. It's definitely been true the last maybe 5 or 6 years. Many organizations, some academic, some nonprofit, environmental, etc. They have been really conscientious about including the humanities, including the arts, music, and literature into their programming. And, so it's always a strange thing to receive a request, kind of a commission to write a poem on a certain topic where, as you said, as a poet, I'm really more often writing about just what moves me in the moment. And so it's a bit of a challenge, to write a commission poem like that. But I've started to really enjoy it because, it really makes me think about, the audience that I'm reading it for. It kind of has, I think, reaffirmed the belief that poetry does play an important role in environmental literacy, for example, or in decolonization movements, or just in really any kind of social justice activism. And it's great when especially here in Hawaii, where you attend a march or an event, there's always like Hawaiian chanters and hula dancers, and then also musicians and poets. And so it's nice to see the arts being fully integrated into all of these movements. And so I love it. And it's nice to know that there is a desire for this kind of work, and really how important it's become especially within the environmental justice space.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Craig again for this amazing reading and the Q&A. Thank you so much. And we are moving on to the next section of our event. And I'm going to briefly introduce Lorraine Higgins, who just asked a question too. She is a professor in the Humanities and Arts Department, teaching on rhetoric and writing. And she's also the co-director of the Melbourne Project Center together with Steve McCauley. And she's going to take the floor for our next section. Lorraine.
Great. Craig, you're a tough act to follow, but we are going to have our Project Center directors give a brief overview now of some of the work that we're doing at each of the 3 Oceania Project Centers. I am co-director of the Melbourne Project Center with Steve McCauley, who you'll hear from a little bit later. And next slide, please. Oh, there's our kangaroo. And here you see some of our students working at the Melbourne Project Center on St. Kilda Beach here with the Port Phillip Eco Center. And the Melbourne Project Center is over 23 years old. We were established in 1998. And over the years, our students have completed 229 projects involving 832 students and working with 45 partnering organizations. And we have a brief list here. I'm going to go ahead. So you can see we work with a real range of community organizations, nonprofits, government agencies, research groups, et cetera, on a range of topics. We began back in 1998 by focusing mostly on fires, fire safety, fire prevention projects. But currently, we really address a range of themes, and we're in Melbourne 2 or 3 times a year now. So we do 18 projects a year in Melbourne. I think our longevity has allowed us to establish really close relationships with some of these organizations and to do sustained work on particular kinds of issues. And if you look at the photo here, you see examples of our work with microplastics, pollution, and we've been working with the Port Phillip Eco Center for probably the last 5 years, a handful of projects. At the top, you see our students doing a beach audit, looking for samples of microplastics and analyzing them. And below, you see a group of students last year who designed a mid-water pump to collect microplastic samples. And this design can be replicated by water keepers across the world. A little later, you're going to hear from April Seymour at the Eco Center, and she can tell you a little bit more about the work we've done with them on microplastics. Next slide, please. Here we go. So as I've mentioned, we do a lot of projects related to the environment, sustainability, alternative energy. We also do educational projects, however, in disadvantaged communities. Our students have developed science education modules for young children, and we have worked with nonprofit groups to do after school programs, including a mystery room our students developed to teach students about the human body. So we're working on the environment, we're working on educational issues, cultural preservation. We've worked a lot with Melbourne Museum and with neighborhood settlement houses and city councils on issues like healthcare and job creation. So that's just a little bit about some of the work we do. Because our 25th anniversary is coming up, we've also done some assessment in recent years, and we have learned from our student alumni that the value of these kind of partnerships and programs really lie not just in learning about some of the global issues, but in learning about different perspectives in different cultures. And our students tell us that they learn to work in diverse groups. They've learned to collaborate on intercultural and interdisciplinary teams. And that the project work has changed them personally. It's given them a different image of themselves in relation to their communities. Some of them have even told us that they've developed new professional goals because of this project work. So we're really proud of those educational outcomes. When we talk to our partners on the ground in Melbourne, some of our community organizations, we have found, and you can go to the next slide, that we've had different kinds of impacts in the communities themselves and on the organizations. About 83% of our partner organizations said that projects they worked on had a high level of impact, either on the way they operate as an organization or the communities that they serve. And you can click ahead here. So some of our students' research has been used to help people get grants. Some of it has been used in the Coroner's Court of Victoria, actually. Some of our work on hoarding and fire safety has been reported and used and published in international fire publications. We have also developed methods that community organizations can use for advocacy and for outreach. And these are just some of the kinds of impacts that our partners tell us that we've had. So we're very proud of this work. You can go to the next slide. I'm gonna leave you with an image of Melbourne at night. And you're going to hear a little bit from some of our partners and our students working on current projects in some of the panel sessions coming up later. But for now, I will conclude and leave you with Lauren Matthews, who is going to give you a quick overview of what they're doing at the Hawaii Project Center.
Thank you, Lorraine. So the Hawaii Project Center is kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum from the Melbourne Project Center, which is one of our older, longest operating project centers at WPI. The Hawaii Project Center is entering only its third year of operation. And we have a new cohort of students that officially began their projects just last evening. So they're still a little shell-shocked and intimidated, but I'm sure they're going to do great. The center operated in Hilo on Hawaii Island in the winter of 2020, when 16 students completed projects with 4 organizations that were working in various locations around that island. And then in the winter of 2021, we operated remotely. And in the winter of 2022, we're going to have our inaugural group of 16 students working with organizations on Oahu. And this is where we're going to be located in future years as well. So here you see our first group of WPI students who were at this time preparing for their final presentations in Hilo in 2020. It's the only student group photo I have from Hawaii, because we haven't yet had another student group there, but we're going to be there in just a few months. So next slide, please. The center, as I've told you, is quite new, and for that reason, I'm going to tell you about where I think we're going to be going in the future. We're going to be working on strengthening our collaborative relationships with organizations in a number of different areas, including in particular environment and climate resilience, which I think is going to be a core area for our work in Hawaii. Also community development and history and culture. So I also think that while the center is going to continue to host IQP teams every year, and forming relationships with organizations with respect to IQP project work, I also see a lot of potential for developing other opportunities, such as faculty collaborations with local individuals and organizations, as well as potential graduate research. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ingrid, who is going to tell you about the New Zealand Project Center.
Thanks, Grace. So next slide already. The Wellington Project Center is situated in the beautiful capital city of Wellington, as you can see here on the North Island of the country that is also known as Aotearoa. Professor Mike Elms and I launched this center coming up on 10 years ago as an opportunity that partly stemmed from Mike's 2005 Fulbright scholarship to New Zealand, where he taught a course at Victoria Management School. We founded the Project Center to direct and advise students on collaborative research with local agencies and area community organizations, much like the other models we have heard from this evening. And as you probably know, a unique component of our university is our emphasis and expertise in project-based learning across the curriculum as a means to broaden perspectives specifically for STEM students. At our project centers, the third-year projects ask undergraduate teams to examine complex questions that require stakeholder engagement and field research as part of that process for building perspective and also building critical community skills. We use a kind of shared mentorship model that has distinct phases for student effort. The preparation phase requires preliminary research through essential skills, readings, and proposal development. Our data collection phase has a focus on face-to-face interaction to encourage students to learn from narratives, from interviews, from local experts, from listening to communities, and from partnered meetings. We also have reflection work with student prompts to build personal awareness and dialogue about perspective building through their experiences. Next slide. So it's important to know that our research is both for and with hosts that are built on longstanding connections and partnerships. We've been running the center every year for 10 years from January through March, with this last year and this year being entirely remote, as you can imagine. We've completed more than 55 projects through partners in the Wellington region, including local, regional, national, governmental agencies, universities, research institutions, NGOs, nonprofits, community organizers, and the School of Maori Studies at Victoria University. We work regularly with Greater Wellington Regional Council, the Department of Conservation, and various departments and schools and staff at Victoria University, as well as local community-based organizations. To give you a sense of the projects we have completed, our topics range from human-animal conflict, biodiversity, climate change, to database development, science communication platforms, among other things. Some recent titles include work on the digital Maori world, understanding food rituals, development of Kaitiki Kids Conservation Program, understanding science communication and sea level rise, and inviting citizens to reduce invasive pests. Next slide. Looking ahead, the Global School will offer master's programs in climate change and community climate action. As we work increasingly in New Zealand towards decolonized narratives and science communications in the grand challenges domain. Our vision is that this will eventually, hopefully, lead to collaborations between graduate students and faculty who can collaborate together on critical issues in reciprocal partnerships and shared expertise with our partners in Wellington. Thank you very much for listening. At this time, we will take a 5-minute break. We will return after the break to hear from 2 different panels of students reporting on their work from the Australia Centre and from the New Zealand Centre. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us in the second half of our presentation. This portion of our presentation this evening features two student panels discussing elements of their work from sites this year. We will begin with the students from the New Zealand Project Center, speaking this evening on the topic of blending Western and Indigenous knowledge, a topic derived from our experiences with learning how to prepare STEM students to work with our Maori partners. Before we get started, if the student panel could just make themselves visible in the room, and I will change my view so I can see you. So I'd like to ask our student panel, welcome everybody, and I'd like to just start very simply with asking each of you to just say your name, even though it's written in your Zoom box, but also your major, because I think it's important for our audience to understand that you are in fact STEM students, and this is sort of a new element of your education this past year, your work with our partners in New Zealand. So why don't we just go ahead, and I'll start with the bioheritage team, and then we can go to the ESAT team and then wetlands. So we'll go in that order. So Tim, just introduce yourself and your major.
Yes, hello. So my name is Tim Snow. I'm a mechanical engineering student here at WPI. I took part in the New Zealand Project Center during last year, so my junior year, current senior. And I completed it alongside two other students who are also a mechanical engineering student and a civil engineering student here. So we cover a lot here at WPI. I suppose, is the next slide mine on here?
Wait, let's wait, and I'll just do the names and then I'll
okay,
come back to
gotcha. You. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, so ESAT team, Tyler.
Oh, hi everybody, I'm Tyler. I'm a senior studying mechanical engineering, and I'm representing Team ESAT. So we had a couple of other seniors on the project from different majors, including mechanical engineering, robotics engineering, and biomedical engineering.
Thank you. Wetlands team.
I can go first. I'm Caroline. I'm a senior studying civil engineering with an environmental concentration, and I worked with three other people, two of which are present today. So,
hi everyone. I'm Daniel Dietrich. I'm a current senior as well. I'm a mechanical engineering student, and I was also part of the wetlands team alongside Caroline and Brooklyn and Mung, who is not with us tonight, but she is a chemical engineering student.
And I'm Brooklyn. I'm a BS/MS student in biomedical engineering and management. And like Daniel and Caroline said, we're team wetlands.
Thank you. So I just really want the audience to appreciate the range of backgrounds that the teams bring to this project. And it should be clear to you that the students' primary focus in their majors has really very little to do with the topic or perhaps as a minor, but the students come in quite fresh to this topic. So I would like to now go back in the same order, and if each team could just give a very brief overview of two items. One, what was your project about? And secondly, what was a concept or a vocabulary term or something that you had to struggle with or relearn or re-understand or develop some capacity around in order to work with your partners in Wellington? Go ahead, Tim.
Sure. Is now the time for my slide?
Yeah, you can, so we can go to the next.
Okay, gotcha. I wasn't sure. So as I said before, I worked with three other students on this project. I worked with Dr. Maria Barge and Dr. Carwyn Jones of the Victoria University of Wellington through a program in New Zealand called the National Science Challenges. And our project was all about understanding biological heritage and finding a way to combat that through exploring different effective governance strategies and means to achieve them. So because New Zealand is such an isolated island, it has a very unique bioheritage, not like anything you'd see anywhere else in the world. And due to the fact that human settlement, invasive species have been introduced to New Zealand pretty recently in human history, as well as climate change posing an increased threat. these species have become at a higher risk more recently. So our project set aside some objectives to understand tikanga, which is Maori law, documenting different community perspectives through different interviews and whatnot with different professionals in the region, as well as comparing governance strategies themselves. So through this research, we were able to discover strategies and outcomes of governance in order to discover indicators of positive biological heritage outcomes. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that's essentially the essence of our project.
Great. And do you want to move to the next slide and we can talk about the terminology and the framework that was new to your project?
Sure. So I put down two here. I put down Mataranga Maori, which is essentially translates to Maori knowledge, a very holistic, I suppose, multifaceted aspect of their culture, where they take a look at basically everything in nature and society and incorporated it into one term of overall community knowledge. And one of the essential terms behind our project was two-eyed seeing, so not necessarily Maori, but there was this Mi'kmaq elder from North America who recently passed, named Albert Marshall. He theorized this idea called two-eyed seeing, where you take indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge or colonial knowledge. You essentially view them as two pillars of knowledge, and you don't use either to wash out the other or flush out the other in terms of trying to find a solution to something, but you view both equally in order to achieve an even and balanced result. So that was the approach our project took.
Okay, thanks. I'll just go through each team and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more conceptually about the challenges and the outcomes for your project. So let's just go next to Tyler, a similar format.
Yeah, so my team was working on, our project was called Evaluating the Environmental State Assessment Toolkit. And the other members of my team were Ashley Baldwin, Gabriel Dudlicek, and Elizabeth Rocco. Next slide, please. So my team was tasked with evaluating a prototype ecosystem-based management tool, also known as EBMTs. And they're basically used for assisting with decision-making processes for environments and ecosystems. Our sponsors are ecologists in New Zealand, and they developed a new EBMT called the Environmental State Assessment Toolkit, or ESAT for short. And the tool is unique in that instead of using narrow Western metrics to assess the health of the environment, it can use cultural values to improve the assessment. So the goal of our research was to provide our sponsors with recommendations on three aspects, including the ease of use, technical features, and the cultural adaptability. Next slide, please. So my project didn't directly involve a Maori term, but two social themes that were involved in the project include decolonizing science and inclusive decision-making. So because of the unique features in ESAT that utilize traditional ecological knowledge, there's a huge potential for involving new and diverse concepts from different cultural groups, as well as mitigating Western influence on science from being the primary knowledge base when you're evaluating some sort of data set. So with inclusive decision-making, one thing that my team found quickly was that one of the reasons that ESAT is so effective in New Zealand is because of the social infrastructure in New Zealand is inclusive of both Maori culture and Western culture. So there's a level of trust between different people, which allows them to work together when it comes to things like decision-making and policy-making.
Thank you. Let's go to the next slide. Go ahead, team.
Hi again. So we are the wetlands team, and my team and I worked from October to March on the role of wetlands in the Ruamahanga catchment. And for those that don't know, the Ruamahanga catchment, it's on the North Island of New Zealand, just north of Wellington, and it contains the Ruamahanga River and the Wairarapa Moana, which includes Lake Wairarapa and the surrounding wetlands. And many of the wetlands have been drained for flood prevention and farming. And from our findings, 97% of the wetlands in the water upper Moana have been degraded. So our goal was to collect perceptions of the economic, environmental, cultural, and social importance of wetlands to the Ruamahanga community. And we achieved this goal by identifying 3 different objectives. One, we documented how the wetlands within the catchment are used, managed, and defined. Then we identified and recorded the Ruamahanga community's perspective on wetlands and ecosystem stewardship. And then we built an understanding of how the economic value is determined from the wetlands in the catchment. And these objectives provided some insight into the cultural, social, environmental, and economic baselines that helped build greater cohesion towards a sustainable restoration of the wetlands. Next slide, please.
So the Maori term we decided to come and talk about, it's more of a concept, which is the Maori sense of place, which I think we kind of all talked with our sponsors, and Ra Smith, one of our sponsors, told us about the tohi, which is a traditional blessing performed after the birth of a child. And it's performed where the mana of one body of water meets another at a confluence, a mana essentially meaning life force. And then after this, you have the mothers bury the placenta, of the child in the whenua, which also translates to land and placenta. So during a tohi, you're essentially, like Maori are essentially rooting themselves to the land physically and spiritually. So this concept I know it had a lot of Maori words in it, but it's just kind of important that we were including all aspects of it just because it is so important to their culture.
Thank you very much. And that ties in so nicely with the poems that were read earlier by our keynote. And so I just want to ask a couple more questions. We have about 10 minutes. So I just want to ask a couple of questions of anyone in this panel that would like to respond. But, these concepts are complicated, they're complex. I know, all of you individually struggle to learn and understand, get your minds around these. And can you just describe what you found challenging, or what was the most difficult part about incorporating these ideas into your work and your recommendations? Or maybe it wasn't difficult. Maybe you found it, maybe it was a natural process for you, but just if you could reflect on that.
I can answer to that. So I think that one challenge was definitely making sure that we were being respectful and, making sure that, we're not there present. We had to do this virtually. So we're talking to people on Zoom. And I think it's kind of hard to let the wall down a little bit more when you're on a screen. So truly kind of getting every aspect that you want to is a little bit harder. And especially because we're talking to Maori people who are already facing so many issues, they're going through, there's a higher poverty rate, there's marginalization, and it's hard to get people to even have time to participate and make sure that we're also not just prying into their life and asking them questions as students from a university who they are just meeting for the first time.
Great. Did one of the others of you want to respond to that same question?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Caroline. We did a lot of interviews, and we did them with a lot of people from different backgrounds, and they obviously all had certain interests and things that they thought needed to be done to solve the problem. So I think it was kind of difficult to figure out how to give space to each of those groups and identify some ways that they could all come together and understand each other a little bit better.
Great. Tim, did you want to comment? I thought I saw you, but.
I was debating it. If I had to say something, it wasn't really mentioned with ours, but the fact that our project essentially revolved around trying to balance essentially two different viewpoints. theoretically. So trying to, in our heads, not try and drown out any one idea over the other and incorporate essentially a whole different group of stakeholders, different types of stakeholders into one cohesive solution. So that was challenging, especially from a distance, having not seen the people and not coming in completely ignorant. You don't know their culture, you don't know the nuances of how they do things there. So you wanted to be respectful, as Caroline said, and make sure you address things in the most fair and righteous way possible.
Do any of you, what advice would you have for us at WPI about how we could better prepare students who are working on projects like these? What do you wish you had learned more about in advance?
I think if I had had a better understanding of the culture and just the importance of the wetlands that we were working on to these people, I know initially when you hear about it, you don't maybe associate such a spiritual impact or an impact on that whole group of people. So I think that having that understanding that this is very tied to their lives and their traditions, and it's important to just have respect. And when our people are sharing their struggles or how they're relating to the nature that we may not relate in the same way to just be respectful of that and give them space to react however they need to.
Does anybody else want to give us some advice about how we could better prepare STEM students?
I can maybe add on to that. I think that, so we did learn like a little bit about the culture and a little bit about way of life in terms of our ID 2050, so our prep course we take ahead of the IQP, but maybe even having a course that we would take as a first year student or our sophomore year about, like global environments, global ethics, global cultures might be beneficial not only for students going into a project like this where you're communicating with people from thousands of miles away, but also, the fact that our world is becoming ever so connected, that having a fundamental understanding about how to approach talking to other cultures, how to understand other cultures, how to respect them is something that might be fundamental to try and teach people.
Mm-hmm. So looking back now that all of you have had a year since your projects, what are some of the takeaways that have stayed with you or that you think about this project?
I think one thing that's really stuck with me personally is just like the importance of being open-minded when it comes to interpreting or analyzing data, whether it's like qualitatively or quantitatively. Because with IQP and our ID 2050 prep class, we had to read a lot of text and interpret data. And it was important to be able to comprehend them from multiple viewpoints, just so that you can get like a holistic understanding of what you're studying.
I would agree with Tyler. I think looking back on IQP, what stuck with me the most similarly, it's kind of being like having multiple perspectives, being a global citizen. It's kind of easy to be caught in a bubble and be narrow-minded, but understanding a different worldview can provide so many opportunities to collaborate with others and build perspectives and positive relationships that are only possible when you have an open mind. And I believe being a global citizen allows people to kind of work towards a better future.
Great. We have about 10 minutes left in this session, and I would like to open to Q&A in the audience. And I have a couple of questions that came through on the chat. So, so here's a question from Lorraine. Lorraine, do you want to ask the question directly or should I ask it for you?
Sure, I'll reframe it a little bit. As you were identifying the different ways that different stakeholder groups valued the wetlands, can you give us an example of times when certain values were at odds with one another or came into conflict? And also, can you give us an example of when there was some overlap in the perspective, some places of possibility where people might work together?
I could speak on that. I think one of the areas of overlap was the idea that they wanted to keep their land fertile and healthy. I think both sides, both the farmers and the Maori people, both want a healthy ecosystem and a healthy environment. They just have different paths in which to get there. And a little bit where one on the side when they rubbed heads maybe a little bit was when the farmers are, the Western knowledge of farms is to drain wetlands and utilize the fertile soil, but they don't consider the benefits that wetlands can provide. And they're often open-minded to it, but they're a little hesitant because they've used these practices for decades and they don't necessarily want to change right away.
I think going off of that too, there's like so much more overlap than we really expected in the first place too, because I think doing research, just reading, we're like, oh, it's like one person wants to drain the land and the other person doesn't, but it's more like these lands have been drained and now it's about how to revitalize and how to move forward. So I think agreeing with Daniel that most of the, like any kind of disagreements, I think we're just one side not really understanding the where the other person was really coming from. And then I think one of our recommendations even was talking about increasing education of like Maori cultural values for farmers, because a lot of their values do even just like help farming practices. So
Thanks, team. I have another question in the chat and then one in the Q&A that I want to get to. So a question from Dean Scheller. Mimi, would you like to ask the question or can I read it?
Sure. So you might have already answered this question in some ways, but maybe I'm just putting it in a different way. And I'm thinking about how, as students, you have been really deeply trained in like the scientific perspective of, just data and evidence and experimental methods and, rationality, materiality, things like that are just part of the sort of Western scientific tradition. So is it impossible to actually deal with spiritual aspects of life within the scientific perspective? And did your efforts to try to balance this, as you said, this two-eyed way, did it change your sense of your own worldview and how we approach nature?
I can speak on that. So I think that I actually felt that the science was very important to understand, but maybe the spiritual aspect was more important to kind of understand the broader implications. And I think a lot of times as engineers, we think oh, we can solve this problem, we'll just do this. And we don't necessarily think what the impacts of that will be and how that might affect other groups or things that are unrelated to the problem that we're trying to solve. And I know for me personally, every time I go by a wetland area, I always think about my sponsor, Ra, and his connection to it and how meaningful it was to him. So I think that it definitely changed my perspective. And even as biomedical engineering, I think about my impacts on animals or plants or whatever materials we're using to achieve our end goals. So it's definitely changed my perspective.
Thanks.
If I could add something really quick. So an important aspect of at least what our group did was understanding, not shutting out either viewpoint. So looking at things from a spiritual perspective, looking at things from a Western scientific perspective. One of the things that actually the entire New Zealand Project Center looked at was decolonizing science. We actually have a whole unit on it, actually, where we looked at typically mainly Western methodologies and methods of going about collecting data, understanding different ecosystems, environments, and going ahead and decolonizing that and understanding the inherent biases that can be present in those systems due to them having been theorized in, London in the 1500s or something like that. So really taking both pillars and viewing them equally in order to produce an effective result while not shutting out either of them.
Thanks, that's fascinating.
Tyler, I would just ask you, because you haven't had a moment to jump in, and I know that you had an ecosystem measuring tool that you had an engagement with a UMass professor who was using a Western version of an ecosystem management tool, and then you were presenting this idea that you could add cultural weightings on ecological well-being to a tool. And can you just talk about his reaction to that as an idea?
Yeah, I think he was really excited about the idea of incorporating a different like knowledge base or cultural system to kind of like a technical, more quantitative tool. And he was telling us about like all the potential global implications this would have, because it's pretty effective in New Zealand, since in New Zealand they already have that trust between the Maori people and kind of like the Western society that also lives there. But in other countries, it could also provide kind of like a stepping stone to form relationships with the local Indigenous people. So that was something that he was interested in as well.
Thank you. There are two questions in the Q&A, and I want to get to both of them in the time remaining. So here's a question from Professor Eddy, and it's for any of you on the panel. And it says, do you think that your prep term, without as much contact with Maori people and their culture, operated as at a disadvantage? Could you have understood the importance of honoring Maori tradition without actually knowing other human beings who embodied these points of view?
I would say it's hard when you don't have that direct contact with a person. Like meeting Ra, our sponsor, who is Maori, that completely not shaped our perspectives, but it's so impactful to hear someone speak about their direct experience and hear their tone of voice and hear him like tear up almost or get choked up talking about how impactful these things were in his life. So I don't think you can necessarily get that from reading an article, but he also recorded a series of lake stories, they were called, that talked about the impacts of development and his experience and traditional Maori things that they would do in their culture. And I think that was a good way to get an understanding too. But definitely meeting with him and seeing him face to face on Zoom definitely helped a lot shape those ideas. Yes, yeah, human contact.
I think going off of that too, I don't say it kind of put us at a little bit of a disadvantage, but I think it almost kind of helped us understand how much there was a gap without that human contact, because like prior to, like Brooklyn said, like meeting our sponsors, we were just doing readings. So like she said, like that emotional kind of like a tone of voice stuff, it wasn't there. But I definitely think the lack of it being there at the beginning almost made it so much more significant, because I don't know, maybe it was just like after like so long of like having one idea about it and then having that change. But I'm not sure if it put us really at a disadvantage, but we definitely could have had more knowledge. It's just a different type of understanding, I think.
Tim, I don't know if you have thoughts about your project. It was quite abstract. A lot of your work was deeply engaged with philosophical readings and governance structures and much more complex. Do you have a point of view on whether or not that, being present or reading versus actually having conversations made any difference from your work?
Sure. I don't think it made a huge amount of difference with us being there or not in terms of the prep and actually trying to grasp how Maori tradition functions in their society. For our project in particular, it was kind of interesting because we approached it and we started doing our methodology for the project, but there was a little bit of a tense political climate at the time in New Zealand in regards to Maori involvement in government and parliament. So I think at the same time, it was a blessing in disguise because it allowed us to understand the, nuances and kind of importance of being careful and how we perceive and interact with Maori. Because for our project and for most of the projects here, unless I'm speaking out of line, we didn't really interview or interact directly with like a tribe or very, I guess, central part of Maori culture or iwi. But I think that was a blessing in disguise because it allowed us to understand that, allow us to understand our place as students studying such a complex topic.
And I just want to clarify for the audience, it's partly because we were remote, so everything was by Zoom and not on site this time. Okay, there's one last question and we have about 10 seconds to address it, but Kent Miller is asking, I'm really interested in this work. Other than this session, have you had opportunities to communicate your IQP experiences with family, friends, or other audiences? How can we do more to share your lessons with others? I know, and maybe Mike Elms, you'd like to jump in because you've actually been sharing some of this work that has been done from a site director point of view, although we haven't had many opportunities to involve our students other than this venue right now. You're muted.
I don't have anything to add other than most people I talk to are very interested in it. I'm not sure they're always sure what questions to ask. I think but I'm just curious if the students had a chance to. I'm sure your parents said, "Well, what did you do there?" And how did you answer that?
I told people on my way over to my apartment to hop on Zoom today all about my project because I love to talk about it. So, I mean, I'll really tell anyone that'll listen. And my parents watched my presentation and they asked me some questions. But yeah, I think it's great to talk about, and I'm always happy to share it with anyone who asks.
Thank you. We're actually out of time. And on that note, I would like to suggest that that's a great launching off point for how we at the hubs can really kind of share the knowledge of working with STEM students across perspectives and really get our students involved with amplifying the work that they've done. And so maybe this is the moment to propose a conference at WPI to highlight our students' work. I would at this time like to thank the panelists for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time tonight to chat. And at this time, I need to turn the panel over to Steve McCauley and his Project Center students from Australia. Thank you very much, team.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good evening and good morning to those who are over in the Oceania Pacific region. And thanks for staying. This is our final panel for the event. This panel, I should say first, I'm Steve McCauley. I'm the co-director of the Melbourne Project Center with Lorraine Higgins, who you heard from a little while ago. This session will be looking at some emerging research around microplastics, which we also heard about in Craig's opening of the event. Some emerging research around microplastics in Australia, and also one project that looks to expand microplastics research to other regions too. So we'll look at that. Our first panelist is actually a distinguished guest panelist, not a WPI student at all, but April Seymour is the executive officer of the Port Phillip Eco Center. And the Port Phillip Eco Center has hosted, I think, 10 projects now of WPI students, and several of them, around 5 or 6, have addressed issues of microplastics directly. And the Port Phillip Eco Center is really a leading voice in microplastics research globally, really. And so we're really lucky to have April with us and to hear about the work that they've been doing on that. Following April's contribution to the panel, we'll hear from 2 different student teams. One of them is just starting their project, and we'll be working with April and the Port Phillip Eco Center on an important question around regulation of microplastics. And the guys on that team, I'll ask you to introduce yourselves when you after April's talk. And also, like the earlier team did, if you could please share your major when you introduce yourselves. And then following that team that's working at the we'll be working with April and the Port Phillip Eco Center, is a team that did not work in Oceania, but we welcome them and we're really grateful to have their contribution. That's a team that just completed a project in Iceland, actually, looking at how research and methodologies around microplastics research can diffuse into other regions and potentially to our other project centers around the world. So we're looking forward to hearing from them as well. And guys, if you could also introduce yourselves and your major when your slides come up. So after the three panelists, we'll have 10 minutes or so for some Q&A. So please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A at any point during the panel to the guests. So thanks, I'll turn it over to April. Thanks for being here, April.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm really excited to be here and to hear from everyone else, to hear from the presenters earlier and panelists earlier. And this because a lot of what we are working on with WPI and as an organization at the Port Phillip Eco Center, recognizing that issues often cross jurisdictions and we can find solutions that are useful across jurisdictions if we find ways of collaborating. Zoom and being online has not been ideal, but it has opened up some of the sorts of cross-sectorial work that we do in Australia. So, and so for some of your other projects as well, I can see. My name is April Seymour. I'm from the Port Phillip Eco Center in Melbourne, Australia. We're a city of 5 million people. We speak 241 languages altogether, and we all live around the catchments of beautiful Port Phillip Bay. So the Eco Center is a not-for-profit community environmental hub. You can see some of our team members in the lower left of this slide in our botanical garden home, but we work across 140 suburbs. We work all around the bay and its catchments from the mountains to the bay. And one of our flagship programs that's around protecting land, waterways, climate, community well-being, wildlife. One of our flagship programs is Port Phillip Baykeeper. So the founder of the Eco Center, Neil Blake, who you can see with his iconic beard, this was obviously pre-mask times. Both of these photos are pre-mask and social distancing times. Neil's in the center of the bottom left photo. His current role with the Eco Center is as Port Phillip Baykeeper. That's an independent voice for the health of Port Phillip Bay. And our Baykeeper team takes a range of engagement approaches around Port Phillip Bay health, everything from citizen science and more formal scientific research to engaging with the media and occasionally dressing up as a musical anti-pollution pirate, touring festivals and kindergartens. So we are, as the Baykeeper team, a member of the Global Waterkeeper Alliance. You can see more of the water keepers from around the world in miniature up in that left-hand photo from a conference in Buffalo, New York a few years ago. There are more than 350 grassroots organizations across 6 continents who identify as water keepers for a particular water body or bay or river or lake or Himalayan glaciers even. And each of us is working in our own cultural context for fishable, swimmable, drinkable water for every community. There's about 6 continents that are covered by the current 350 water keepers. And I've been really lucky to be able to collaborate, not just at a local level through the Eco Center, but with the Australian CSIRO, National Geographic, and water keepers in Bahamas, Mexico, Indonesia, Kenya, and the US, of course, where I'm originally from. In Chesapeake Bay is my home watershed as a child, on issues of plastics. We're all concerned about plastics and plastic pollution in aquatic and marine ecosystems in particular, but a range of other impacts and issues that it causes. So the challenge is that plastics, everything that makes it a convenient or handy or affordable product, also turns into something problematic. Its flexibility, its stretchability leads to entanglement, and this eventuates in different shapes and forms in different species in agricultural land and cattle eating it, versus or wildlife that you may have seen awful photos like this and iconic photos like this. The fact that it's long lasting means that it persists in ecosystems and in fact inside of organisms. Even from extraction of its of the fossil fuels to make it in that part of the life cycle, it causes problems. As it photodegrades in sunlight as litter, it emits greenhouse gases, and it also is lightweight, so it's easy to leak out of management systems, whether by wind, water, poor management, or animals interfering like these two sulfur-crested cockatoos in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. It also adheres chemicals, it absorbs chemicals, and therefore it can pick up a lot of bad things in the environment. And when it gets into the food chain, it's bringing along a little sponge of toxins. So plastic is a problem. All of us, even whether it's the animals or the human animals on this slide, are all quite concerned about plastic. And it's been fantastic to have WPI collaborate with us over the last 4 years, looking at how we tackle this issue. Because of course, one challenge is finding a way to balance rigor and reliability and repeatability of any studies you're doing with being able to do the storytelling and the knowledge application, so that when you're learning things, it's actually getting to the right people to apply that knowledge in the best way. And turning knowledge into action in terms of what our team is doing, here's a few bits of what the Eco Center's worked on over the last few years. Clean Bay Blueprint is riverine trawls, coastal surveys, land surveys. This was a holistic catchment to coast approach, and looking at the plastics, where they're coming from in the catchment, to backtrack them to hotspots in hopes of designing better interventions and prevention campaigns. And it involved a lot of collecting samples in different modes. And then we had manual, visual, and also spectroscopic analysis of all of the litter items that we found in the waterways, streets, coasts, and bay. And we found, we were the first to quantify the billions of pieces of litter that are coming from urban rivers, surfaces, down to Port Phillip Bay, of which more than 85% is microplastics. And tens of thousands of those samples were manually sorted and evaluated, measured and categorized before going for lab analysis. You can see in the lower left some of our WPI students smiling, and not too many of them were wearing glasses yet. You know, this is when you're looking at pieces of plastic 5 millimeters or less with your bare eyes. I think I probably with my glasses would be less good on this, but you can see what a cheerful activity it is when people undertake it together, sorting organic material from these microplastics, measuring and categorizing them. And another happy way that we've approached this dastardly problem is with Scouts Victoria. Scouts Street to Bay was acknowledging that a lot of the litter surveys or cleanups that happen often overlook microplastics because you're probably looking for what is easy to see, containers or large items of pollution. And so this project started with a few curious scouts and spread to scout groups across all of the greater Melbourne area, collecting data over surveys, hundreds of surveys across a few dozen suburbs over 2 years. So in the end, more than 25 scout groups and 500 people audited 128 sites. Those were representing a few different land use types to tell us more about where plastics were coming from and what was being found on the land. What we find in our waterways, you can see our bay there is mostly enclosed. So in some parts of Australia and Asia, you have things washing from rivers or from ships or shipping containers outside of the catchment. For us, anything we're finding polluting our bay is pretty much coming from our own streets and community, which does present excellent opportunities, if we understand what it is, to design meaningful interventions and effective interventions. And the current work, some of what we're doing, is looking at citizen science fit for legal use. We've got many environmental groups, thousands of people around Greater Melbourne doing different kinds of environmental monitoring and surveys. We've been working over the last several years to help them work on the scientific rigor of that data collection methods and models, but We're also now, under new Victorian environmental laws, able to have stronger enforcement potentially, depending on early precedents, for holding polluters accountable and also holding industry accountable to preventing harm in the first place. So you don't have to have polluted to be held accountable. We're doing some work around that to look at what community data could be rigorous enough to be used in a court case or a prosecution situation. So that might be about establishing the environmental condition before or after a pollution event, or it might be about a specific pollutant that is being found, or identifying areas for potential harm by something that should be or is common state of knowledge in an industry, and finding evidence of an entity that isn't putting those best practices into place. With all of these different aspects in terms of creating change, creating laws, creating state of knowledge in science, it's been so fantastic to have WPI student cohorts with us since 2017. The first group, you see on the left, worked with us on reviewing and collating methods. This was really important for us as we worked to get this catchment to coast approach. We needed to partner with many other organizations who think about plastics and science a lot less than our team might. And so putting things into easily shareable, clear packages, whether data sheets or reference site materials with safety or history of the site information, was really helpful. And this group was responsible for reviewing the methods, making recommendations, and helping us with some of that collateral to describe and train and upskill other groups and community members in these rigorous but repeatable survey methods. A few years ago, as we were going through our Clean Bay Blueprint surveys with river trawls, we were aware that we were only getting data on the surface of rivers. And alarming as it was, that's not the entire picture. That's only picking up buoyant polymers, buoyant plastic particles. So this student cohort worked with us on a microplastics collector with a pump, which we technically were calling as a nickname temporarily the McWAP, but it kind of stuck. This is a depth sampler to go down to 2 meters of depth sampling of a waterway. You can be on a boat, but you don't even have to have a boat, which allows sampling in shallower or non-navigable waterways and allows us to understand what's happening literally below the surface of these rivers that we know are delivering pollutants down to the catchment and then into our beautiful bay. This was made from easy to buy, fairly affordable materials and in a size and design that would be able to be carried out into the field easily, because our hope is that this could become, after we get the opportunity after post-lockdown to do some further field testing in 2022, we'd like this to be an open source blueprint rather, to waterkeepers around the world to be able to do affordable testing and understand the plastic and microplastic concentration in their waterways, whether they have a boat or not, whether or not they can afford. I mean, our Manta net is $3,000 US dollars for comparison. This was around more like $500 US dollars to make this device, and everything could be bought from your Home Depot kind of equivalent, so Bunnings or an auto body shop in Australia. And currently, we're going to hear shortly from students working with us about a plastic pollution significance threshold. The power of data and storytelling combined is that the Eco Center was able to get plastics and microplastics, 3 little words, added into the law as illegal waterway pollutants. But without having a figure around this or a significance threshold, it is essentially more philosophical than enforceable. And so this student group is working with us to look at a sensitivity curve or other ways of modeling at what concentration can we begin to declare the plastic pollution officially dangerous and begin to compel land and water managers to take action. As you can imagine, something where we're looking at impacts on human health, there's not just scientific questions, but ethics questions and how you determine this. And then it's not just having good science, but understanding the politics of how you take that and begin to create a cultural understanding and convince people like politicians and decision makers to integrate that and to begin to resource and enforce it. So we're thrilled to be working with WPI. I think it's a global issue. We also recognize that it's an issue of environmental justice where plastic pollutants disproportionately impact Indigenous communities, developing countries, communities of color. This is an issue of not just scientific significance, but also of environmental justice significance. And that's pretty exciting to be on the leading edge of it, collaborating with you and your students, Professor McCauley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, April. Really, really helpful to hear what you're doing, and really great work that you're doing. Thanks. So let's take it right over to the team that will be working with April in the Eco Center at this coming up term, Alex, Jacob, Drew, and Travis. So why don't you guys come on, introduce yourselves and share your major with us, and just introduce us to the project that you have started and will be working on.
Hi, I'm Travis, and I'm a computer science and computer engineering double major.
Hi, I'm Alex Almazan, and I'm a junior mechanical engineering major and business minor here at WPI.
Hi, I'm Jacob Morin, and I'm a chemical engineering, mechanical engineering double major.
Hi, I'm Drew Solomon, and I'm an electrical and computer engineering major and computer science minor.
So our team is working with the Port Phillip Eco Center and addressing the question, how much is too much? Next slide. Microplastic pollution is a growing issue around the world, especially within the Port Phillip Bay, located in the state of Victoria. To help combat this issue, our team will be working on a project this term with the goal of determining a process for developing a microplastics pollution threshold for the Port Phillip Bay. Our process for implementing this threshold consists of 3 components. Next slide.
Okay, so the first essential element needed to make our threshold implementation model is a method for measuring the level of microplastics in a body of water. Right now, we currently have 3 main methods we're considering, and they each have their own unique benefits and shortcomings. The first is just taking samples of water from the body of water and seeing how many microplastic particles you can find in that sample. The second method is to use biological samples, because there are species out there that we call bioindicator species, which includes mollusks, mussels and shrimp, which can give a reliable reading of the level of microplastics in the water they live in when analyzed. And the third option is beach audits, which consists of sampling a body of water's beach sand rather than the water itself.
So the second element of our implementation model is a species sensitivity system. So this is a model based on analysis of all the species in an environment with the goal to determine the species with the lowest tolerances to a given pollutant, which obviously in our case is microplastics. So once these species have been identified and studied, then a pollution threshold can be set in order to protect the sheer majority of the species in that environment.
And the third element of our threshold implementation model involves the enforcement aspect. So this is to make sure that our threshold value is actually being maintained and respected among a given area. Next slide.
Our first objective to complete this is to track the emerging developments within California. To do this, we're going to perform a case study on everything going on within California during our project term.
For our second objective, we will be narrowing down the possible methods we have for sampling microplastics down to the most viable and effective for our model. And so to do that, we will be analyzing each of our methods for what the costs and logistics would be, such as the money and manpower required, the consistency of the results that we could get from each of these methods, and also the usefulness of the data that can be extracted from the results of each.
So for our third objective, we will be determining vulnerable species in Port Phillip Bay. So to do this, we will be performing interviews with marine biologists to determine which genera are most likely to have species with low microplastic tolerances. And then from there, we can use online databases to identify specifically in Port Phillip Bay which species will be most vulnerable to microplastic pollutants.
And for our fourth objective, which is determining methods to enforce a microplastic pollution threshold, this would involve identifying any stakeholders that we believe would be essential for the enforcement process, as well as finding which steps of the enforcement process that each stakeholder could potentially be involved in. And that's about it.
Okay, thank you guys for that overview. Maybe we'll come back to you with a few questions afterwards if we have some time. So thank you. And now we'll bring in the team that has just returned from Iceland, and we'll hear about their work on microplastics and maybe have a chance to think about how it can connect to Australia and other places in Oceania and other places. So Iceland team, do you want to come on and please introduce yourselves and share your major with us as well?
Hello, everyone. We're very excited to be here today. I am Billy Garvey, and I am a chemical engineering major.
My name is Aaron Boyer, and I'm an aerospace engineering major.
My name is Patrick Highlands, and I am an ECE major.
Hi, sorry about that. I'm Jared Leonard, and I'm a data science major.
And our project was leveraging WPI project centers for collaborative microplastics research. Next slide, please. So originally, we set out to develop a citizen science microplastic sampling program in Iceland. However, as we considered the possibility of not being able to travel and having limited contact with existing Icelandic organizations, we shifted our project goal to a more global approach. We saw that WPI has a huge network of over 50 project centers around the world with huge potential for global data collection. And we wanted to catalyze this network of project centers for a global microplastic sampling program through the WPI Global School. This would be a relatively new approach to IQPs as they usually tackle issues on a local level. So our revised goal was to leverage WPI project centers for this collaborative research. We conducted a survey and interviews with WPI project center directors to understand their perspectives on the possibility of collaborative research at WPI. Next slide, please.
So in our survey, we asked 12 questions about collaborative research about at WPI and microplastics as a pilot program. From the survey, we found out that collaborative research is only happening in a limited capacity at WPI. Only one individual responded that they actually participated in collaborative research frequently, that being Ingrid Shockey, whose Story and Climate Change project we modeled for one of our deliverables. In addition to this result, we found that even though most project center directors do not currently participate in collaborative research, all respondents said that they would like to participate in more. Next slide, please.
So after learning that project center directors both want to engage in collaborative research more and that they do not currently, we wanted to know why this is and what barriers could contribute to this. And overwhelmingly, the survey responses focused on 3 factors and that are currently barriers to collaborative research at WPI. And these are organization, time, and communication. In follow-up interviews, we asked more in-depth about these barriers and got very valuable responses. The first thing we noticed was that project center directors interpreted these barriers in different ways. Responses for a lack of time could mean that a 7-week term simply isn't enough time to complete a globally connected IQP. But then others responded that a lack of time could mean that 2 project centers that want to collaborate with each other don't operate during the same term, making collaboration very hard. Responses about communication focused primarily on the language barriers that exist between project center countries. And lastly, lack of organization was due to the fact that this is a fairly new way to conduct IQPs. And as such, the infrastructure for this type of project just isn't in place yet. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we addressed these barriers in 2 main ways. The first was by creating a microplastic sampling kit, and the other was by creating a website that brings together past microplastics projects at WPI, such as those conducted at the Port Phillips Eco Center. So the prototype kit we tested and created consisted of a 100 micrometer stainless steel mesh that was placed in a funnel, along with a 5-liter bucket for gathering water from the ocean. After collecting the water sample with the bucket, we would pour it through the mesh and the funnel. Any particulate matter that was in the water would be caught by the mesh, which could be taken out of the funnel and analyzed. We found the kit to be simple and easy to use, with the entire sampling process taking less than 14 minutes to complete. We also designed a website that showcases past student work on microplastics WPI, in addition to serving as a place for students to upload and view existing data. We hope that the website will encourage future microplastics research, in addition to serving as a hub for collaborative microplastics research at WPI. Next slide, please. And thank you so much for coming and listening to our presentation, and thank you for the thanks to the Global School for giving us this opportunity to share our project.
Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for sharing your work from Iceland and work on thinking about how we could kind of elevate or expand the work that we do at any particular project center to have more of a regional or even global kind of impact through our work. So thanks for sharing that perspective. I think we're running close to the end of time, so we won't have a lot of time for Q&A on this one, but if you do have a question you want to ask, please drop in the Q&A now. I did want to go back with one question just to clarify on the team that's going to be working with the Eco Center coming up this term on the threshold. Could you elaborate just a little more on what it is you're seeking to understand from California, and why is that? What's going on there?
So with the California case study, we hope to get a better understanding of how the professionals will go about creating a threshold similar to the one we want to create.
Okay, thanks. So California is a sort of an emerging leader in establishing thresholds for regulation. So that'll be an important one to keep an eye on. And I know you guys are right there at the front edge of this emerging scientific and regulation question. So we're really excited to see what you come up with to help inform this important global issue. I was really interested, April, that you brought in the question of social justice in your talk and connecting back to the themes that Craig had raised in his opening poetry, which was really amazing. So often I think we think of microplastics as these little chemical things, and we understand their impacts in marine ecosystems, but somehow it's a little bit divorced from the social impacts. So I'm glad you mentioned those uneven impacts in different communities.
Yes, and I give two examples just within our watershed. And being from the US originally and moving to Australia, the phrase environmental justice is less familiar or commonly discussed here, although it's really emerging, particularly around climate issues. And Asia Pacific, we have so many island nations. But in two examples of things that we're working on right now are where microplastics are actually shedding from synthetic turf, which has a range of issues and problems in its use, but that's often used by a private sports club or sports facility, and then it washes down and ends up in waterways where different communities might be using it for a fishing area and end up consuming something, or it might be just amenity compromised in a public space by an activity for a smaller group on a private piece of land. And we know from around the world and the work that the studies that have been done around the world, it might be obvious even to describe, litter tends to accumulate in lower areas so sort of a downhill area. Things flow downhill, and all of us who live in our castles tend to build them atop hillsides. So you can begin to see how there's a socioeconomic correlation to where pollutants accumulate, gross pollutants and microplastics accumulate and begin to impact different lower socioeconomic communities. So as part of a commitment that all the water keepers around the world have made to integrate more justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies explicitly in our work, one of the elements we'll do with the current project and our local collaborator is a map of waterway condition and pollutant hotspots with our socioeconomic and ethnic groups and cultural groups overlaid to begin to understand who we need to represent, engage, and be listening to more closely for health reasons in the greater Melbourne area, which is quite diverse.
Great. Thanks, April. And there's a question from Dean Scheller who asks, I'll just pose this here. Have any of you worked on the consumer side of educating people about trying to reduce their plastic usage or consumption? Any of the teams, have you started to confront this? And or April, have you worked on that side?
So we personally did not engage in educating the consumer side on reducing plastic usage, but one of the projects that we did curate for the website that we made was based in Berlin, and they did do that in educating school children through elementary and middle school, I believe, on plastic usage and how to reduce microplastics and plastics in general.
Yes, so we do some work there, but we do believe that ultimately we want to go as close to the source of the pollutant problem as possible, and that often that's an industrial source. So we do engagement from everyone from little kids up. We believe that engaging people in citizen science, even if they don't know that's the word for what they're participating in, is really quite transformative and different than saying plastic is bad and there's a lot of it in the environment. Once you go out and do a beach clean, it looks like a clean beach, but as soon as you zoom into some quadrats and recognize how many microplastic pellets or shards of plastic bottles or pieces of green astroturf or cigarette butts that are found there, it's really hard to unsee. And I think it does give that embodied reaction to understand the problem and begin to make personal changes incrementally.
Right, and Lorraine Higgins points out that one of our teams did create an animation that helped communicate about the dangers of microplastics and where they originate, some of the sources of microplastics. Great, well, thank you so much to all the panelists, the two IQP teams, and thank you, April, for joining us in your morning over there in Australia. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Lorraine Higgins to help close out the event.
Well, we'd like to thank everyone for coming and to acknowledge the support of the Provost's office at WPI and all the WPI staff who helped organize this event today and who support the various project centers associated with the Oceania Hub in Hawaii, New Zealand, and Australia. We'd also like to thank our guest speakers and panelists for sharing their work. And we hope to see many of you again in person once borders are open. In the meantime, we wish you good health and we thank you for working toward a better and more sustainable future. Thanks all. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.
That was awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Good job. Thanks, April.
Ciao for now.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.